Essential Self-Care Podcast, a podcast for those of us who are, let's face it, too busy for self-care. In this podcast, you will hear real life stories from people who leaned into their self-care as they were navigating life's storms. You'll learn practical tips, tools, and strategies to incorporate self-care into your own busy life as well. You'll hear from expert guests sharing their expertise on specific tools and modalities of self-care to optimize your well-being in your life, career, and relationships. I'm your host, Dr. Sheetal Ajmani. I am a physician, best-selling author, and founder of Radiant Living Institute, where I guide high-achieving women to get unstuck and learn to live radiantly again through major life transitions. Quick disclaimer before we dive into the episode, please know that this podcast is for educational purposes only and is not medical advice. Always seek the advice of your own health practitioner or mental health provider for your specific situation. Now, let's get started. Hello, and welcome to another episode of the Essential Self-Care Podcast. I am so excited for today's guest. I've been looking forward to this conversation because it is always so wonderful to be able to bring an old friend, a dear friend, onto this show, sharing her journey and her expertise. So today's guest is Jennifer Marie Young. Jen and I met many years ago, I would say maybe around 2015, 2016, somewhere around that time frame. In the DC area, we were both offering our services at Bhakti Yoga DC. So shout out to Bhakti Yoga DC. If you're in the DC area, definitely check it out. I have moved away from that area to Southeast Virginia. So I am no longer offering my services at Bhakti Yoga DC, but Jen is. So if you're in the DC area, definitely visit her. Definitely visit the studio. Great things happening there. But that is how we first met. And we have kept in touch even after I moved, and she has been such a wonderful friend and supporter of my book journey that I'm on of writing a book, and she herself has a book coming out really soon, and so I'm so excited about that. So today, in addition to her sharing a bit more about her self-care journey, I hope that she will also share with us a little bit about her book, but a little bit more about Jen. She specifically guides her clients through conscious movement practices. She integrates yoga, personal training, martial arts, performing arts, herbalism, and medical astrology in her work with clients. So I really love, and hopefully this will tie into our conversation somewhat today, because I love just multifaceted approaches in general. So I love seeing that. And she's also, as I mentioned, the author of the soon to be released book titled, or she continues to offer group yoga classes at Bhakti Yoga DC. And she also offers private offerings as well. Welcome to the Essential Self-Care Podcast, Jen.
So great to be with you today.
Yeah, I'm so excited for us to be able to have this conversation today. And so let's start out. I know I packed a lot in your intro there, but let's start out with your self-care journey, self-care story. One of many, because as I always say on this show, self-care is a journey. But can you share with us an instance in your life where self-care became no longer an option, but an absolute priority for you? And more specifically, and more importantly, what sort of tools or modalities did you turn to at that time?
Yeah, I would say when the lockdowns happened, or the shutdowns from the 2020 pandemic, that was a time for me to really become aware of how much I needed more self-care. Because I was a yoga teacher, so as a yoga teacher, I was running around town, taking buses to all my gigs, teaching yoga, teaching meditation, doing sound healing work. And I didn't really realize what a toll that was taking on me until the pandemic happened, and I couldn't do that anymore. And I was forced to just sit and rest. And I had been experiencing a lot of anxiety nightmares, things like I would be dreaming that I showed up late to a class and got into so much trouble from doing that, or I had to take care of emergency things and I had to make all these decisions between taking care of this emergency thing or taking care of my obligations. And so it really became apparent to me that I needed to stop running around so much and that I had to do some detoxing, not necessarily of like food that I was taking into my digestive system, but food that I was taking into my mind so that I could let go of some of those anxious thoughts and feelings. And so I was also on this path of really wanting to be masterful at something because I am very diverse in my interests and I'm a perpetual student, but I just had this feeling that I wanted to become more of a master at something. And about that time was an astrological transit of Venus turning retrograde in Gemini. And so what that means is Venus is like the senses, your sensual life, enjoying beauty and that kind of thing. And Gemini is really related to the mind. So I realized that it was an exactly 42-day journey that I could take during this time of being locked in my apartment by myself to use it as a retreat.
Thank you so much, Jen, for sharing and setting the context for this self-care journey that you are taking us on, that really started at that time during the pandemic. I know you were already on a self-care journey, but in terms of the specific aspect of it. And a couple of things that I wanted to reflect on from what you had shared. One is that you had shared that it wasn't really until you were forced to slow down, right, that you really realized almost the amount of stress that you had been under of driving to, different studios, commuting to different studios, taking the bus, right, to get to all of your classes. And it's so interesting because, and I can speak to this as, a yoga instructor as well. And, I'm teaching some classes now. At that time when you and I first met, I was teaching more classes at that time in the DC area while also working part-time as a pediatrician. And so I know I can say as well, we many of us go into these healing fields as a yoga instructor, bringing some sense of peace into other people's day. But sometimes the nature of that profession, we don't even realize, like, you're running from studio to studio, from gig to gig, and it can actually start to take a toll on your own well-being, your own self-care practices, and your own yoga practices. And so it's something that for those of us in this field, it's so important for us to be mindful of that as well. And so, it sounds like it wasn't until you were forced to slow down that you really realized the impact that it was happening and that it was having on your body, mind, and emotions. And I can say for myself as well, there's been times in my life, various situations, a variety of situations where it was like, I didn't realize until I was out of the stressful situation. And then looking back, I was like, oh, wow, I was under a lot of stress at that time. And it's almost like when you're in this situation, it's a lot on some level, it's impacting you on some level, but it's like when you actually take that time to pause and rest and slow down, it's like it really hits you. And I've had this conversation with a few other people as well, of not necessarily on this show, but in general, just friends that it's who've noticed something similar, that it's like in that slowing down, it's like, oh wow, I really was under a lot of stress at that time. And so I found that interesting that was an experience for you as well. And then something else that I wanted to reflect on is that you mentioned that sort of going through this detox, but not only of the food that you were ingesting, like the actual food, but the food that you were giving to your senses and to your mind. And that's something that, and I'm really excited to dive into what we're going to dive into next, because Ayurveda talks about this as well. Ayurveda, as you know, I've studied Ayurveda, which is the ancient medical system of India. And that also talks about how we digest not only our physical food that we eat, but we digest our emotions, our experiences, our memories, everything that we take in through our sensory input. So there's so much that really goes into that digestion. And so I love that you mentioned that and brought that up as well. And then you mentioned this time of Venus retrograde. And I know that you have studied and have some expertise in astrology. I do not. But you did mention that it was this time of Venus retrograde, which for you felt like a great time to have those 42 days to really retreat and develop some mastery in a specific area. I was wondering, before we dive deeper into that specific area of Pratyahara that you had mentioned, before we dive deeper into that of what you were developing that mastery of, can you tell me about Venus retrograde? Because I don't know anything about it. Like what is the significance of that particularly?
Right. So just to let you know what retrograde means. So retrograde is actually an illusionary phenomena that we experience here on Earth. So when we are looking out at the sky, it can look like a planet is actually moving backwards in the sky, which it's really not, because the planet is actually going around the sun, but because the direction it's taking, it looks like it reversed its direction, even though it just, spun around the sun. And so we have, most people know about Mercury retrograde because it happens more frequently. It happens 3 times each year, and people, freak out about it because Mercury is associated with technology. And so all of a sudden things go awry with our technology.
That's about all I know about the planets and retrograde, because all I know is that when technology is not working for me, okay, maybe that's what's going on today, because for those of us listeners, hopefully I have edited this well enough that you did not notice, but we have been having a lot of technical difficulties. I don't know, Jen, is Mercury in retrograde? Because anytime I'm having technical difficulties, and like I said, I don't know anything, I don't know a lot about this, but I'm always like, Mercury must be in retrograde.
He will be the end of next week, April 1st. He will be April 1st, 2024. He will be going retrograde and it's usually a 3-week transit. But as we're speaking, he is conjuncting Chiron, and Chiron has to do with the wounded healer, the wounded warrior energy. So maybe it has something to do with that.
Oh,
too.
Interesting.
And we're about to have eclipses, and Mercury's also just transiting over where these eclipses will be happening next week and in 2 weeks from then. So yeah, that definitely, there's stuff going on with Mercury for sure right now. Okay. But going back to Venus and what a Venus retrograde can be about. But back
to Venus retrograde.
Yeah. So what I have learned is that these mythologies that talk about 40 days and 40 nights, especially around enlightenment and awakening, are associated with this transit of Venus going retrograde. So that was part of my inspiration for doing this practice, and creating a retreat for myself. Was like, okay, Buddha went into retreat during this time, maybe. We hear about 40 days that he, sat under the Bodhi tree, and Jesus Christ went into the desert for 40 days, 40 nights. And there's many, many more myths all around that time frame. So, and Venus retrograde tends to be between 40 and 43 days, depending on what sign she's moving through and things like that. So during 2020, it was a 42-day transit, which works out to 6 weeks exactly. So it was a 6-week practice that I did every day, and I journaled about it, and I really not only did actual practices, but I really started to pay attention to my senses and their cravings. Like, we think about cravings as things we're attached to, but cravings can also be things we're averse to as well. So I was really paying attention to that, and also just learning about my senses. And we kind of take them for granted. Like, how do our senses actually work? Was a question that I asked at the beginning of my practice. And I was
I
really
love that.
blown away.
Yeah, I love that. You went on a deep exploration and introspection yourself of your senses. And how did you do that in terms of, like, because it seems like, you had the 42 days, the 6 weeks in mind. So, like, did you take it like one sense at a time that you were focusing on and doing this sort of deep exploration and introspection on? Quick shout out to today's sponsor, Reclaim Your Radiance, Radiant Living Institute's signature coaching program designed to help you reclaim your worth, renew your energy, and restore your happiness in your life, career, and relationships. This 6-module curriculum has already helped countless women rediscover themselves through life's storms. From setting difficult boundaries within toxic relationships to finding their inner strength and power while navigating divorce and co-parenting, to aligning their career and business with their authentic self, and to learning how to live for themselves again after their kids have left the nest. This program has been a guiding force for women to live unapologetically and shine brightly within their lives once again, or often, even for the first time ever. Experience the results for yourself. Head over to radiantlivinginstitute.com/reclaim-your-radiance to learn more and get started. Or how did you do that? How did you go about it?
Yeah, I decided to do one day I would devote to just one sense. And beyond the 5 physical senses that we talk about from a science perspective, I was also looking at both, the yoga tradition, but also I had come across something from an Egyptian hieroglyph that suggested that there is another sense. So I ended up working with 7 senses. So there was touch, taste, smell, sight, hearing, and then thought and breath. So those were the 7 senses that I worked with. So I devoted one day completely to each sense. The first week was that just noticing what's going on with my senses. How do they operate? What are they really about? And then the second week was about what are my attachments with these senses. And the third week was what are my aversions? And then from there, I started to think, well, there's something about the heart too, and how can we connect our senses with our heart, or our heart with our senses? So that's what I explored during the 4th week. And then the 5th and 6th week, I really explored different practices that are associated with Pratyahara. And that was really fascinating too. Not only what I learned, but also just how many practices you could put into that category.
I love that. That's so interesting. And it's such a great framework to share with our listeners. So, observing the sense, noticing your attachments related to that sense, noticing any aversions to it, noticing the connection with your heart, and then specific practices. And for those who are listening, just to kind of give a little bit more context here as well. So, Jen and I are both certified yoga instructors. We have gone through multiple yoga teacher training programs and really have studied yoga. And yoga, most of us think about yoga as simply the physical practices. That's usually the first thing that many of us will think of. That's what we see most commonly just in modern day culture. But really, yoga, as described in the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali and some of these yogic texts, is really an 8-limbed path. And Pratyahara is one of those limbs on that path. And so it's really 8 steps on that path. The physical poses are actually also one step in that path, but there are actually 8 steps that are 8 limbs that are described in the yoga philosophy to study, to master, to practice together. And so this pratyahara, or sense withdrawal, or an inward calling of your senses, is one of those steps on the path. And that is what Jen, having done a deep dive on so many levels of yoga practice during those 6 weeks, took that deep dive into this specific limb of that. So I just wanted to further give that context for our listeners who may not be as familiar with the entire not I was going to say the entire yoga philosophy, but I don't mean to say that, because certainly neither me nor Jen nor really anyone is probably familiar with the entire yoga philosophy, because it is a study of a lifetime, maybe many lifetimes as well. And so what I'm curious about then is to kind of go back to your journey and your story here. You found that through the slowing down that the pandemic forced upon your life, all of our lives, you realized the amount of stress and anxiety that you had been up, the amount of stress that you were under, which then showed up as anxiety, as these anxious dreams and thoughts. And then you used this Venus retrograde time frame, so harnessing that astrological influence to also develop a sense of mastery with regards to pratyahara and senses. And so what I'm curious then is, through that process, through that 6-week process, either while you were going through it or after it, what did you find? What was the result? What benefits did you find? What did you notice or observe about yourself through that experience?
Yeah. Oh gosh. There's so much that came through, and it came through in synchronicities. So things that I may not have been aware of before suddenly popped up. Or another example I like to share is I had been in Egypt, I guess maybe 6 months before, and there we had been in this temple, and the facilitator of the retreat I was on said, which of these images of Horus, so Horus is one of the deities associated with the sun, or I guess they call them netters, which actually means nature being. And she asked, which one of these hieroglyphs of Horus reminds you of victory? And so I had picked one where Horus is standing facing a pharaoh, and the pharaoh has a dish, and in the dish is the Eye of Horus. And the Eye of Horus is a very familiar symbol you might recognize, which is an eye, and then it's got like a little squiggle coming down below it, and a little curlicue, and a very strong eyebrow. And what he was handing this dish of this Eye of Horus to Horus, and Horus was holding out this scepter. And all of a sudden, as I was sitting there in my practice, I suddenly realized what this hieroglyph was saying, which is that if I, as Pharaoh, give to the divine my senses, the divine will then give me power, will give me that divine seat, and I can sit on the throne as Pharaoh. And that was just so amazing to discover. But also what I learned about that Eye of Horus hieroglyph is that it's made up of all the glyphs for the senses. So in that glyph, it's the 5 senses, but also the eyebrow represents thought. And that really was very curious to me. I hadn't thought about thought as a sense. And so I couldn't quite wrap my head around what that meant until I actually looked at the origin of the word thought and think. And the word think actually means to cause to appear to oneself. So that's kind of also a lot to chew on and digest as well. And I realized it's like an inward sensing. You know, when we're thinking, we might be drawing on what we've taken in from our senses from the exterior, but we're actually bringing them up from our memory, or maybe they're coming from a more divine source, or vice, or maybe the opposite, depending. But that took me a long time to reconcile with and to really sit with. But it was probably one of the biggest insights. And since that time of that retreat that I did for myself, I really understood breath as a sense. And that also was, I kind of understood it, but now I have a deeper sense of it as I've studied the breath in more detail. And what I've learned is that breath allows us to sense within ourselves. We can sense our inner organs. We can sense our heartbeat. What we might call introspection comes from being able to connect with our breath. And when we can't connect with our breath, we can't feel what's going on within ourselves. And so that's one of the reasons why breath is really strongly associated with emotions as well. And so those two, understanding thought and breath as senses, has been completely life-changing for me, for sure.
Sure. That's really interesting. Thank you so much for sharing more about your journey and just this deep dive into the senses. I think it's something that for so many of us, we can be so busy, just like you started your sharing your journey, right? We can be so busy running from one thing to another, and that we don't often take time to even notice our senses. But like we talked about earlier, we really do digest, not only our physical food, but we digest everything that we take in through our senses, and we need to we process all of that as well. So all of this is really constantly, all the time, going on in the background. Without us even realizing it, right? Like what we're listening to, what we're seeing, what we're feeling, what we're thinking, right? Our breath, right? Obviously is always going on, right? And so I hope that this conversation and this discussion, I think will, for our listeners, perhaps give you something to consider, to just notice, start to pay attention to some of your senses in whatever small way that you can in your day-to-day life, right? Maybe if it's even just taking a few moments in the morning, a few moments on your lunch break, or in the evening, just to start to notice and pay attention to the senses. Like, what am I taking in through these different senses? So I hope that this conversation, gave our listeners just kind of maybe a different way to start to think about their senses, and thinking about your senses as a way of practicing self-care. Of even just, and starting with that observation, that awareness, that noticing of it. And then if you do want a deeper dive into the senses, I know that Jen has a couple of really great resources for that. So could you please share those resources? Specifically, what I'm thinking about, Jen, is the quiz that you have, as well as your book. And then if there's any other resources beyond that, certainly please share that with us as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So I actually wrote a book about my journey, that 2020 exploration, and it's called Rain, Harnessing the Wild Power of Your Senses. And if you want to find out more about that, you can check it out on my website, jennifermarieyoung.com. And I also have a quiz, and the quiz is about understanding which sense really steers your mind, which is the most dominant sense for you. I can sort of say that in our culture right now, the most dominant senses are sight and hearing, because here we are plugged in, right? And when we talk about unplugging for a day, what we're really talking about is giving our eyes and ears a rest from screens and devices, which is so important. So you may discover that in this quiz, you may discover maybe one of those is your most dominant sense, or you might be surprised to learn that it's something else. So I encourage anyone to check that out and maybe learn something new about yourself.
Absolutely. I took the quiz earlier today. Mine came out to smell, which was really interesting. I was surprised by that. Although it reminds me of such a funny story. When I graduated college, I went on a backpacking trip across Europe with my best friend. And I remember we were on this overnight train, and in this overnight train with these, like, there were like 6 sleepers, right? And we were in there with like other people who we didn't know, obviously. And it smelled so bad. Like, we couldn't sleep in there. We had to stand out in the hallway all night, like literally all night. So I don't know, when I got that response about smell, that was one of the I don't know, it's sort of like visceral, like sensory memories that came to mind. But then I also had pleasant thoughts of how that makes sense, because I love using my essential oil diffuser at home. So, but a couple of those memories and ideas kind of came to my mind as I did that quiz. So I will include the links for the quiz, as well as where you can learn more about Jennifer, her work, the book. I will include links to all of that in the show notes. The quiz takes about 5 minutes. It's easy, free. It's fun to do. She has lots of these fun images with each question as well. So definitely check that out. Thank you again for being here on the show today, Jennifer, and for sharing your journey with us.
My pleasure. Thank you for hosting me. It's been a lot of fun.
Thanks for tuning in to this episode of the Essential Self-Care Podcast. If you like what you heard, be sure to subscribe, leave a positive review, and share this episode with someone you know. And remember, your free guide, 6 simple yet powerful steps to create your radiant life, is waiting for you at radiantlivinginstitute.com. Download it today.